It works! Oh my god, yes! So I think maybe we should record some kind of quirky intro, like I get up, right, like this. Let's talk about books. Welcome to the book club! We're finally in video format and not on stream. Hooray! Well, I say finally, but it's not like I've been planning this out for months. But I would just really like to share my thoughts on the books that I've read in 2022 so far. So I just want to tell you how I got back into reading, because I think that's really nice, because I owe it to anime. So in like November 2021, I started watching, or November-ish anyway, I started watching an anime called Bungo Stray Dogs with my friends, and we would watch like 2 to 3 episodes per week, because we meet up once every week, right? So it took a while for us to finish it, but I really loved this anime, right? And there was a character in it that I at the time particularly liked. And the thing is that I've noticed a pattern where a lot of my favorite characters tend to be born in June, or their birthday tends to be in June. So I was like, yeah, I'm gonna look up this character, because obviously his birthday is gonna be in June as well, right? So look him up, and turns out his birthday is in fact in June. I was right. It's a pattern, guys. It's a pattern. But more importantly, I found out that this character is actually a real guy. This guy existed back in the day, back in Japan, and he was a real life author. And from that, I then found out that that the characters in Bungo Stray Dogs are all based on they're on authors who used to exist mostly in Japan, but also some other well-known ones around the world. And so I sort of went down this rabbit hole, right? And the characters in that show have abilities that are named after notable works. This character, Dazai, he had an ability called No Longer Human. And because I liked this anime so much, I looked up No Longer Human, which is probably his most well-known work. And that is the first book I read in 2022. And I've been reading ever since. So I'd like to start there. I'm gonna talk about these books in the order that I read them. But I just needed you to know that anime was my gateway back to reading, and Dazai was my gateway to a lot of authors that I really love now. So yeah, let's talk about it. So, book number 1. That was very loud, sorry. Book number 1. Dazai Osamu, No Longer Human. So I think it's very important in general to know a little bit about the author when you read a book, but it's all the more important with these authors, honestly, these authors who lived a while ago. He was born in 1909, so that'll tell you, give or take, the time frame and the context in which this was written. So the thing with Dazai is that he had a life full of suffering. A lot of difficult things happened to him. And he did have a literary career that he started, that he was doing decently well in, and it came to a halt when his idol committed suicide in 1927. And it really devastated Dazai, and he started indulging his vices, and he started neglecting his work, and it just sort of seems like his life went into a downward spiral from that point on. He fought with depression all throughout his life, and he had multiple suicide attempts, many of which, I don't know exactly if all of them were, but a lot of them at least were double suicides with women. And at least one of these instances actually ended with the woman dying whilst he survived. So you can only imagine how that must weigh on someone's conscience, right? Shortly after he wrote this book, or he finished this book, he finally successfully managed to commit suicide with a woman, and his body was found on what would have been his 39th birthday. Yeah, I really encourage you to read up on this. I think it's very important to sort of know the kind of mindset the author was in when he wrote this book, and I would really... Wow, I just got totally distracted by Discord notifications. Let me turn that off real quick. Thank you. Yeah, I would encourage you to read up on the author with any book that you read, but you know, especially I think with these people who passed away quite a while ago, or I should say who are no longer alive, you know, so we can understand better why they wrote what they wrote. So No Longer Human focuses on Yozo. We're learning about Yozo's life in the form of notebooks that were found by someone. And much like Dazai, Yozo's life was full of suffering, and a lot of terrible things happened to him throughout this book. A lot of really, difficult things to read about. My camera crashed! Because of course it did. That has to happen in the first video. Of course. I don't know what I was saying. The last recording cut off at the point where I was saying something like the thing that stood out the most to me about this book, and that is the inability of Yozo to express his true self. He's wearing a mask, he's acting in the way that he thinks people would want him to act, or in the way that he thinks would benefit him the most, I suppose, in a way. And that is something that Dazai himself greatly struggled with. He felt like he could never express himself truly and freely. And yeah, this book, you can really feel the suffering that the author went through. You can feel the agony. And it is a relatively dark book, and I would recommend that you are in a good mindset when you read this. I think that if you're struggling from depression or anything similar, then maybe you should not read this, or at least be careful, be mindful with it, because it talks about a lot of dark stuff, it really does, and it's just permeated with this feeling that the author obviously went through. And yeah, of course, with knowing that he took his own life shortly after this was published, you can imagine the kind of mindset that he was in. So yeah, be mindful of that, but it is a very good book and I would recommend it for sure. So let's put that here. Right. And let's talk about the next book. That's The Setting Sun, also by Dazai Osamu. I continued with him because I really liked his writing style. And this book, I really liked it as well. It focuses on an aristocratic family in a time of decline in Japan, and Dazai himself lived in a transitional period between traditional and modern Japan, between sort of traditional Japanese and Western influences, and you can feel that here is sort of this being torn and maybe not entirely knowing where you belong. That's just my speculation, but you can feel the thoughts and the struggles that Dazai himself had, because he himself was also born into a wealthy family, and you can't help but wonder if the way that Kazuko thinks of her family is similar to the way that he felt about his own family. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is that the phrase the people of the setting sun actually became a phrase that is, I don't know if it still is, but was at least at some point common in usage in Japan, and it is a phrase that refers to exactly that, the declining aristocracy. And this phrase came about because of this book, so that should tell you a little bit about how influential this author really was and is in Japan. He is considered one of the great literary figures in Japan, so do keep that in mind. Very interesting. Oh, I can barely reach up here. From here anyway. So after Dazai, I moved on to a different author. I moved on to Akutagawa Ryunosuke. And the reason I moved on to him was because Dazai idolized him. He idolized him, and after Akutagawa took his own life as well, unfortunately, in 1927, that's when Dazai's career and life sort of spiraled downwards, because it really devastated him. And I really admire and respect Dazai's writing, and so I wanted to know, who is this guy that Dazai idolizes, right? So I took a look. This is a book which contains 6 short stories, and that is what Akutagawa does. He writes short stories, and I was skeptical because I've never before enjoyed short stories, so I was like, didn't really know what to expect, didn't have many expectations, but I was open to it, right? Yeah, and you should know that Akutagawa he's also in the circle of the great literary figures in Japan. He's regarded as the father of the short story in Japan. Yeah, so Akutagawa lived until he was born sometime in the 1890s, I think. Lived until 1927. His mother had an illness, a mental illness that he was terribly afraid of having inherited. And because of her illness, she went mad, as he says, and because of that he was adopted by his uncle and raised by their family. Unfortunately, indeed, especially toward the end of his life, his health, his physical and his mental health started deteriorating, and eventually he started suffering from hallucinations and increasing anxiety about this illness that he knew he had inherited from his mother. And so he eventually took his life in 1927 when he was aged 35. Again, I think very important to know at least a little bit about these authors when you read their books. This book contains 6 short stories, as I've mentioned, and I think it's a good introduction, but it's not enough to get a good picture of Akutagawa's skill. With that said, this is the first book I read, and I really enjoyed it. I was very surprised to find that I actually can enjoy short stories. After reading this, I immediately moved on to another book that contains a lot more of his stories, so I'll show you that. And that book is this one. If you've watched the streams at all, then you might know that I love this book. It is Rashomon and 17 Other Stories by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. This obviously contains a lot more stories by Akutagawa, and I think this is the book to get if you want to get into Akutagawa. There is an introduction by Haruki Murakami, who is a well-known contemporary Japanese author, as you might know, or probably know if you are into reading at all. And it also includes a short introduction, I think, by the translator J. Rubin. And from the style of these introductions, you can already tell that this is a book that was handled with great care. Both of the people who worked on this, not that there was only 2 people who worked on it, but the 2 people I just mentioned, obviously really care about this guy's work. And that is really great because they obviously tried their best to showcase Akutagawa's skill. That's one thing I really appreciate, is that this book actually gives you a lot more info on Akutagawa himself in the beginning, and then you come to a greater understanding of him as a person and his life. And there's also information on the different parts in this book that sort of help you understand the context in which they were written. So this book is divided into 4 parts, and the last part, I believe, is called Akutagawa's Own Story. The last part is a lot more autobiographical than most of his other stories, and they were generally written toward the end of his life, where he opened up more in his stories, and he also wrote about the struggles I mentioned before with mental illness and so on. One of the stories in that last part is called Spinning Gears, and it really very accurately describes the decline of a guy's mental health and his spiral into his illness. And I really think that there is a lot of Akutagawa's own experiences in that story. And it's one of the most harrowing stories I've read, and just knowing that that's probably what the author felt himself, I cried. I honestly cried a little bit. He's very good at describing the thought processes of this guy so that you can understand how he reaches the conclusions that he reaches, even though you know that they are untrue, they're false. He makes connections where there are none. He's mentally ill, right? But in general, what you can say about his stories is that he likes to write stories about some kind of issue that he sees with humanity or society, and he wraps that in a story, in a world that he constructed specifically for that purpose. And he does it really beautifully. I find it very difficult to describe, but he has a very nice style. And I love the way he pokes fun at the absurdity of human behavior. It brings me great joy whenever an author does that, and he does it well, and I really like it. Yeah, another thing I wanted to mention that just stood out to me is this guy's struggle with faith. So he mentions multiple times that he wishes he could believe in God or in a religion. And I found that very interesting. He could never seem to reconcile faith with his own skepticism and the way he thought. I would definitely recommend this for sure, but you need to be open-minded, I think, because these stories are probably different from what you might be used to. You need to have an open mind, and you need to sort of be in the mood for it, I think. You need to just, I guess, let it in, let the author in, let his stories in. But yes, this is one of my favorite books I've read this year. Let's put that here. Oh god, is the next one Crime and Punishment? I'm scared of that. I'm scared of talking about Crime and Punishment. So, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I don't know how to talk about this. This book hit different. Let me tell you about the author, right? Dostoevsky is known to be regarded by some as one of the greatest novelists in all of literature of all time. He lived in Russia back in the day. He was born in 1821, I think, and lived until 1881, I think. Don't quote me on that. So he was born more than 200 years ago. That's already wild, okay? Dostoevsky was arrested at some point for reading and discussing banned books, right? And he went through a horrible mock execution. That is to say, he got a death sentence. And he thought he was gonna die, right up until like a minute or so before he was supposed to be executed. And then the people there were like, actually, never mind, you weren't meant to be killed. We're just gonna send you to Siberia instead. So they exiled him for like 4 years to a Siberian labor camp, which couldn't have been fun, I'm sure. And after that, I think he did 6 years of compulsory military service in exile again. After all this time, this book was published, I believe, in 1866. That, I think, is very important to know about Dostoevsky when reading his books. He went through this mock execution and it haunted him for the rest of his life. It terrified him. One can only imagine what that kind of thing might do to your mind. So, I had heard of Dostoevsky before. He is also a character in Bungo Stray Dogs. He was not really my top priority character, but I kept hearing about him, so I wanted to read his book. And the thing is that between the last book I talked about and this one, I was doing my finals, right? Including a literature exam. And I knew that I could not read a new book until I finished my literature exam, because I needed to obviously focus on the books I had to read and analyze for that literature exam. And so in the weeks leading up to the exam, I was always like, my god, I really want to read here Lolita, right? But then I kept seeing stuff about Crime and Punishment coincidentally, and I ordered it and it arrived, a few days before my literature exam. When I had my literature exam, I finished it in the morning. I went home. I was so happy to finally be done with it and actually be able to read something that I wanted to read. I went home and the first thing I did was I started reading this instead of Lolita. It was calling to me. It was calling to me. I started reading this. This book is a commitment. It has 600 something pages. And it is about a poor ex-student called Radion Romanovich Raskolnikov, right? And in the beginning of this novel, we are introduced to him and we are introduced to the fact that he has already made up his mind about a crime he's going to commit. He wants to commit a murder. He's going to murder someone who, in his mind, he has the justification to murder, you know. He's mulled this over for at least a month or so, and you're immediately shown rather deeply his thought process very thoroughly. So he goes on to commit a murder. This is not a spoiler, this is on the back of the book. He goes on to commit the murder relatively early in the book, and the rest of the book deals with the consequences of that, especially the psychological consequences of it, the things that happen in his psyche because he committed this murder, right? I should say that Dostoevsky is very, very good at very thoroughly describing this. So much so that it feels like you're the one who's committed the crime. It really, really takes you on a ride. All the more so because it's such a long book, it's 600 pages. You familiarize yourself with the thought process of the protagonist, with his environment, with his family, where there's some drama going on in his family as well. I remember vividly at some point there was a scene where some family drama was unfolding, and for a moment I had genuinely forgotten that Raskolnikov had in fact committed a murder, right? Which you might think is like the central piece of this novel, but I just forgot about it because everything else was so engrossing as well. And I just found myself, you know, thinking about this family debate and drama, and I forgot about the murder, and then I sat here like, oh my god, I forgot about the murder, how can that be a thing? Raskolnikov is a character that you can condemn as much as you can sympathize with him. You can like him as much as you can dislike him for doing all the things he did. He's a very complex character, and I think most of all, he's relatable because his thought processes are very human. Obviously, you're not going to relate to him for the murder, I hope, but you're going to relate to him for his very human thought processes. This book is an experience. When I finished it, I felt like I had been run over by a train. This book ripped apart my soul. I need you to understand that this book ripped me apart and put me back together. It really genuinely did something to me. One of the themes that I really took with me from this is the theme of responsibility. Because, you know, I think it's very human to believe or to think that you're special in some way, even if it's only a subconscious belief. Because, you know, your life and your thoughts are the only thing that you can truly know. You only know your own perspective. And so it's very easy to ascribe greater importance to it. This book really does deal with that, with this very human idea that you're special in some way, or that you're destined for something great. Even if you don't consciously think like that, even if you aren't like that, it deals with that in such a manner. It forces you to look in a mirror. It forces you to reevaluate yourself. Most of all, I think through Raskolnikov, I just became very tired of the human tendency to not take responsibility for themselves, for their thoughts, for their actions, for their words. I really contemplated this stuff for a while, and this book is a great example for a book that teaches you something by making you experience something, by making you feel the absolute agony and dread that Raskolnikov feels from having committed this murder and being paranoid about being caught and you know, all the consequences. I cannot accurately describe it. This book is an experience, and I think that everyone can learn something from this if they are open to it. I think everybody should read this. I really think that at some point in your life you should read this. This book is so good. I can't hope to possibly do it justice in any kind of review, and I am very, very grateful that I found this author, and if I can never read another book again, then I'm very grateful for having read this one. I don't know what else to say. I can't possibly convey to you how much I like this book. I feel very passionately about this. I think about this all the time still. So, after Crime and Punishment, I wanted to return to something different and maybe a little bit lighter. So what did I do? I returned to our good friend, Dazai Osamu, with Schoolgirl, which is a short novella, and it follows, who would have thought, it follows a schoolgirl who is experiencing a great deal of suffering in her life. And as with the other books that he's written, again, here you can sort of feel the struggle with expressing your true self to the people around you, right? It follows the thoughts of the girl almost more than the plot. The plot is secondary to the thoughts of this girl. It's a good book. You can definitely read this in one sitting. I read it in 2 sittings. I would recommend this, especially, well, maybe not especially, but for me it was a way to read something a little lighter and something to break up the pattern after reading something as heavy as Crime and Punishment. With that said, it still radiates the negativity that Dazai felt in his life. I liked it. I would recommend it. Sure, if you're up for this kind of thing, yes, it's a good book. Oh god, that just fell? Okay. After Schoolgirl, I went back to Dostoevsky and read Notes from Underground. I find it a bit difficult to talk about this as well. This book is split into 2 parts. The first part is the underground man, the protagonist, who is sort of speaking to us from the underground. He's detailing his life philosophies and his views and such, but he's plagued by this event that took place in his past, and the second half of the book is dedicated to that event. It's the retelling by the underground man of this event that plagued him. Again, this does something similar as Crime and Punishment, because through this character, who is not a very good person, but he's relatable because he's human, you're forced to look at yourself, essentially. I honestly have a hard time talking about this without actually talking about Crime and Punishment in secret. I liked it. I didn't like it as much as Crime and Punishment, but it's a good book and you should read it. You should read it. The theme that I took with me the most from this book... What was it again? Fuck, I'm drawing a blank here, hang on. What stood out to me the most in here is the theme of rationality versus irrationality, and especially the need for irrationality in human beings and in life, you know, as opposed to mathematical correctness, as opposed to doing the thing that is objectively always the thing that has the best outcome. And, you know, the theme of free will in the same vein, that is something that I really took with me. And I will say that I do still think about the underground man sometimes when situations pop up or when discussions pop up. I'll think about this guy, which I did not expect. I did not expect this to happen while I was reading this, but I still think about it sometimes. There you go. So after Notes from Underground, I went to an entirely different author. I went to Murakami, Haruki Murakami. This is the first author on this list who is not a Bungo Stray Dogs character, probably because he's still alive. He's a contemporary Japanese author, and I had been wanting to read a book by him for so long because I kept hearing great stuff about him. This is also, incidentally, the guy who wrote the introduction in Rashomon and 17 Other Stories, and it was a very good introduction. So this is the first book I read by him, Kafka on the Shore, and I didn't really like it. I didn't dislike it, but I didn't like it. I think it was a bit jarring for me, the transition between Dostoevsky and Murakami, because Murakami has a very different way of presenting his worlds and his stories. And most of all, the thing that bothered me most, or that I had the most difficulty with, was the surrealism that he uses. And it turns out I am not really a fan of surrealism. It felt to me often like it was used as an excuse for actions that the characters took, or for things they said, or for things that happened, and I didn't really like that. I should say what this is about. Kafka on the Shore follows Kafka, who is a 15-year-old boy, and he runs away from home because he has problems at home. And at the same time, it also follows Nakata. Why did I say it like that? I never read it like that. It's Nakata. That's how I always said it. Nakata, who is an older guy who had an accident in his childhood and is because of that inhibited in his intelligence. He's not as intelligent as he used to be, but he gained the ability to speak to cats. And that's probably the part that I liked the most about this book. One thing that bothered me the most was that Kafka did things and experienced things that he should have had a bigger reaction to. Things that would cause any normal person to freak out, and he just sort of didn't react to it very much. And that really annoyed me, because it made him sort of not very believable in my opinion. He also he gets praise from other characters that make it seem like the book is trying to depict him as a character who is more deep than he actually is. At some point he talks to this lady who's like in her 50s, I think. He talks to her and he tells her some insight that he has about her and some problems she's avoiding, and he's like, hey, I think you're doing this because of childhood trauma or some trauma from your past anyway. And she treats this as though it were a revelation, when surely in her 50 years she must have thought about this before. Besides, it's not that, it's not that profound of a realization. I feel like it's pretty obvious to assume that certain behavior stems from something like trauma. But it's like the book praises him for this. Like, wow, you're 15 and you're so deep. Oh my goodness. No, I can't. I could not stand it. I didn't like it. I did not like this character. And the book lets him get away with it. It would have been fine if he had been called out on this, but he doesn't get called out on it. And besides, there is an implication that he does something, and he tells this to multiple people. And this thing is not a good thing. He did a bad thing, alright? He tells this to people, and none of them are upset. All of them are like, oh, in this surrealistic world, I guess these things just happen. No, I am not into it. You can't convince me like that. I don't like this character. I really don't. Maybe that's what caused me to dislike it. Well, dislike is maybe a strong word, but I didn't like it. But with that said, I like Murakami as a guy from what I've heard about him, and I want to read more of his books. And if you'll see, you probably can't read that, but this is Norwegian Wood by Murakami, and I want to read that after the book I'm currently reading. I'm not going to give up on him this easily. I want to know more about him. I want to understand this author, and I'm not going to read one of his books, dislike it, and then think I'm never going to pick up any of your books again. No. I won't do that. I need to know what he's about, and I hope that Norwegian Wood is better than this. Okay, now we're gonna come to the last book that I read. It is The Humans by Matt Haig. A friend lent this to me. He wanted to see my take on a book like this, on a sort of more lighthearted, I suppose, story. So this story is about a math professor who solves an equation which is very important for humanity, and it changes the world in very significant ways. And because of that, the aliens, they see that and they're like, no, actually humans are not ready for this. Therefore we will abduct this guy and replace him with an alien tasked with the mission to destroy all evidence of this equation that he solved, or that is to say, all evidence of the solution for it, which includes killing any people who might know that he solved the equation. So this alien is sent to the human world. He takes on the body of this math professor and has to blend into his environment, right? And at first, the first part is mostly spent exploring I suppose the society that the alien finds itself in. He has to learn how humans talk to each other, and that they wear clothes, and that they listen to music and stuff like that. He has to learn all of that, and he has to learn about his family in order to blend in, right? Later on in the book, he starts getting attached to his family a little bit, and obviously things get a little complicated. I didn't really like this book either, to be honest. It has a few things in it that I liked, like ideas, especially the idea of free will, for example, that I wish he had expanded on more. I felt like a lot of the stuff that he talked about, he sort of brushed over and didn't really explore. I didn't really care for it. I didn't care for the plot. I didn't care for the characters. It also felt like it was, you know, trying to be deep, but it didn't really know how to be deep. I don't think that was the intention of the author. I think these are genuinely ideas that he has, that he thinks about, that he likes, and that's fine. I just personally didn't like the way he presented them. So yeah, I would not recommend this. I suppose that's it, yeah? I just remembered that I was going to read you like a quote from one of the books, but I didn't do that. I totally forgot. It doesn't really matter. I'm currently reading this book, The Idiot by Dostoevsky, so that's gonna take me a little longer because his books are longer and more dense than, you know, most other books I've been reading. And then after that, I'm gonna read Norwegian Wood by Murakami, as I mentioned. I just spent an hour talking about books. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that you know, you got something out of that. Maybe you'll want to read one of these books. If I had to recommend one of them, it would be Crime and Punishment, but I think that's very obvious that that's the book that I like the most, that I care about the most. In any case, yeah, take care. I will probably see you again on a stream for sure, maybe in a video, I do not know. We'll see. Bye bye.